Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Sarah, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure, thank you. My name is Sara Jordan-Heintz, and I'm the author of the book The Incredible Life and Mysterious Death of Dorothy Kilgallen.
Now, how did you come across Dorothy Kilgallen's name?
Sure, so this was back when I was in high school. My family has a magazine called Midwest Today, and I would do some writing for it, but I got interested in doing a piece on Dorothy. And so a lot of people who are interested in Dorothy know me from the article I wrote for that publication called Who Killed Dorothy Kilgallen? And that came out in 2007. And this was really kind of my first big article that was kind of not the usual featurey type of thing. And I've always loved old movies, old television. I'm in my early 30s, but have always been a bit of an old soul. So I started watching the old game shows like What's My Line, which Dorothy had appeared on from the very first episode in February of 1950 up until the night before her death in November of 1965. And when I learned about what I feel like is her mysterious death, I just wanted to probe into that deeper. And I had no idea that would be kind of a rabbit hole I would go down over the next few years. I'd be contacted by other authors. My work's been cited in several books. There have been kind of some other authors that have come along writing books on Dorothy. And so in about 2020, I decided it was time to write my own book. And I spent some time kind of building off of that original article. Kind of what do I know today? Who have talked since then, and turning it into kind of more of a full biography than just a focus on her death. And then, of course, finding the need to make the book a decent amount about the JFK assassination, since that case had been so important to Dorothy and, at least to me, potentially contributed to her death. So I guess it was about a year ago, Christmas, the book officially came out. And it's been a really interesting experience, just to get kind of the feedback of people's views on Dorothy and women really in general who were kind of glass ceiling breakers, and just learning more about kind of some of the misogyny and sort of bigotry that she faced as a female journalist.
Can I ask, when you wrote that first piece about her mysterious death, did you know it was connected to the JFK assassination at the time, or was that just something you came across?
Well, I knew it was definitely intertwined because that was really the big case she was working on, really from the time of the assassination up until her death. And I definitely go into details on all of the columns that she wrote pertaining to the assassination. A lot of people remember Dorothy from What's My Line as a television panelist. She had a radio show with her husband, Richard Colmar. And she had a syndicated column called The Voice of Broadway with the Hearst Syndicate. And so a lot of people, when my book first came out, were a little dismissive that Dorothy was only an entertainment writer. She didn't cover hard news. What could she have known? How would she be a threat or anything like that? And I think people are just uninformed that from the time she was a cub reporter, she was covering cop and court and the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. She was there for the types of stories that weren't deemed necessarily appropriate for women to be covering. Her father, Jim Kilgallen, was a very prominent journalist for about 70 years, who I think she grew up emulating. And so she was covering kind of the hard news, if you will, very early on in her career. And I think when the entertainment column opportunity came open, it was a great way to kind of merge her love of world affairs and the movies and theater, and because her Voice of Broadway column was not just celebrity news and gossip. They're almost a stream of consciousness. She was very interested in Cuba, very critical of Fidel Castro, and what I'd like to call sort of an equal opportunity offender. I mean, she was very critical of Democratic administrations, Republican administrations, and really used that column as sort of a platform to offer some watchdog reporting, offer even some tips to a sitting president when she was not shy in voicing her opinion. And I think along the way, definitely made enemies.
Now, did she have any pieces of literature or anything that she had published? Like, what was her reputation at the time? Because obviously, like with like Mark Lane, I mean, there's criticism on Mark Lane, there's criticism on a lot of people that were JFK assassination researchers. But I'm just curious what her reputation was at the time, if everyone considered her a good source of good information. Because when you Google Dorothy Kilgallen, it's kind of like known that her death was mysterious. Now, there is a narrative or there is something for it, but I don't know how to like dive through the weaves or weeds on this one because you start researching into or you start looking into the story and you find the connection with the JFK assassination. I find a lot of people just wipe their hands and they go, that's conspiracy area or something like that, and then they just kind of dismiss it. But when you're looking at her reputation based on the articles and interviews or whatever she had conducted at the time, there be a track record of her being credible or non-credible?
Mhm. That's a great question. Dorothy was a Pulitzer Prize nominated journalist. She actually was nominated for her coverage of Queen Elizabeth's coronation. She often attended those big Hollywood bashes, royal bashes. So she already had that reputation. A bit of a digression, she was involved in the Dr. Sam Shepard trial. She covered that for the Journal American. And we all know about that story, kind of loosely inspired The Fugitive, a doctor accused of killing his wife, and it was a very circumstantial case. And Dorothy was among kind of the media circus that ascended on Ohio for the trial. And she felt that they had not proven the case beyond a reasonable doubt, and she was very vocal in the newspapers. You know, the headlines were Dorothy Kilgallen shocked, just to show the influence that she had. And she would later be instrumental in the doctor getting a new trial. That it was appealed and went to the Supreme Court. And based on her testimony, that the judge at the time, Judge Blythen, had made comments to her, which were very prejudicial, and a bailiff did as well. And that's how the case was thrown out, and he got a new trial and was acquitted. And, you know, DNA testing later on said there was likely a third person at the scene of that crime. And so there were those journalistic instincts there, you know, in the 50s. And then unfortunately, she was deceased by the time that second trial came to be. But I think that kind of helps build that reputation a little bit of the cases she covered, you know, kind of maybe some that aren't as well known today, but she was at all of the big murder trials and court cases because people wanted to read her reporting because it was colorful, it was very fly on the wall, the word pictures. I think she was very well respected and well trusted. Millions of people read her. She was syndicated in hundreds of newspapers across the US and Canada. She had a following on radio, she had a following on television. People knew who she was. I think of kind of the famous New York Post magazine comment that was published about her. And I just think it's a really great image to think about how big of a deal she was. And they wrote, wherever Dorothy Kilgallen goes, fame precedes her, envy follows her, and a crowd looks on. She is one of the communication marvels of the age. And you know, she was friends with Billy Graham. She just knew kind of everyone. She knew mafia figures, she knew movie stars, politicians. And, you know, as a journalist myself, I know it's important to cultivate sources. And she certainly did that as she probed the Kennedy assassination. When JFK was killed, some of the first columns she wrote about were very sentimental about the year prior when she and her young son, Kerry, had gone to the White House and actually had a personal meeting with the president. And, you know, Dorothy came from an Irish Catholic family. So I think for a lot of people, that was a significant kind of kinship, if you will.
Yeah. Similarity with JFK. Yeah.
Yeah. And so she was expressing these feelings, you know, kind of this nation in mourning. And then not that much time later, Ruby assassinated Oswald on live television. And the tone of Dorothy's reporting changed dramatically, I feel, in that time that followed. Just days later, she compared what happened in Dallas to the new movie 7 Days in May, which centered on a political coup out of Texas. And I think, in a way, was kind of hinting that she felt there had been involvement, not even mob. I'm not really in that camp. I think more CIA involvement in the assassination. So just to even kind of go there, very critical of security, questioning why the TSBD had not been immediately secured. She also obtained Dallas police, I guess you'd say, kind of car to car transcriptions. And she reported in her column that Jesse Curry, who was the Dallas police chief at the time, who was riding in the pilot car in front of the motorcade, had, after the shots rang out, had wired to get someone on the triple overpass and see what had happened. And of course, that would be from the front. And, not long afterwards, he, like everyone else, got on the bandwagon about the shots came from behind. So she was questioning why the story had changed, lack of security, the TSBD not being secured, how originally the weapon had been identified as a German Mauser by several sheriff's deputies. The weapon later became an Italian carbine Carcano. She was definitely one of the first reporters to question these discrepancies and was very concerned that Oswald would remain what she called kind of a shadowy figure, someone who would remain classified, that we would never really know who he was since there was not going to be a trial where he would be on trial. So instead, she did kind of the next best thing. She covered Jack Ruby's trial to, kind of try to penetrate into this story that I think she just was incredulous that how was Oswald killed? She compared it to having the most important murder suspect in custody since John Wilkes Booth. How did Ruby just strolled into that police department like it was a health spa? So she was very questioning where was the police on this? I don't think she was really at that point into conspiracy because she was a very well regarded serious journalist. But I think the birth of some of that came out of the reporting. We can kind of sit here in 2024 and go, we know this, we know that, it's been declassified. But just writing in real time, she seemed very concerned that justice was not going to be done, that there was already kind of a cover up, maybe, if you will, already in place. And she really, like I said, since, the days following Kennedy's death, all the way up to about a month before her death, she would write these columns, I would even say in a way kind of antagonistic of, we want answers. This is not an adequate information. During Ruby's trial, she learned that his defense team was trying to obtain information on Oswald, and they were immediately shut down by the FBI. And she said that was rather Orwellian. She felt like, why? If this is all just lone nut, one person involved, no conspiracy, why all the secrecy and kind of the information suppression? So that went on.
Can I just ask one thing? A lot of people bring up that it was because the interviews with Ruby was why she was killed or taken out. But the I don't, it's starting to seem a lot more now. Like I didn't know a lot about this early reporting. I had seen some columns by her for sure, but you just gave us a good explanation. It seems like it's because she's pointing at or it's directing the kind of finger towards either Dallas police issues or FBI issues or CIA issues, and that's how you get the title as the reporter who knew too much. I mean, it's you start poking the bear in the wrong area or you start going in the wrong thing, you can this could be a situation where you could be taken out. I'm not saying or blowing the smoking gun on that yet, but I think that especially if you're asking questions, a lot of media back then wasn't asking questions. I mean, the best part about having Penn Jones own the Midlothian Mirror was the fact that it was the first time we could ever really get conspiracy stuff published. Texas Observer's another good example with Ronnie Duggar on there as well too. And then it seems like Dorothy Kilgallen was another one that was really trying to open up the doorway on something because the Jack Ruby shooting Oswald was what I think got a lot of people on board. I'm curious, based on your work on Dorothy Kilgallen, do you think she would have ever researched or written any more pieces if it was just as simple as uh, the president was killed and Jack Ruby didn't shoot Oswald?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, at least in my mind, it seemed like that was when the tone of the columns changed from very mourning, sentimental, this is a time to come together, to just one question after another after another. And one thing that I think people don't always remember is in August of 1964, Dorothy published a three-part series of Jack Ruby's testimony before the Warren Commission. And this was a month before the Warren Commission was officially released. And this launched a federal investigation as to who was the mole, who leaked this information to Dorothy. And that today remains a mystery. And all the Journal American said was, as long as you can ensure that you obtain this information legally, we'll publish it. And so, again, to show Dorothy's influence, we have the transcripts in one column, Dorothy's analysis in another. And in some newspapers, I came across what I would call kind of a call out box that said, federal investigation launched against Dorothy Kilgallen, all on the same page of the paper. And, you know, I think what Ruby discussed had merit. He certainly said he was fearful. He wanted to go to Washington and talk to LBJ. He acted alone. There was no conspiracy. It was a bit rambling, but I think Dorothy wanted to push this out to let people kind of see how crazy all of this was. And so I think that was a bit of a feather in her cap, getting this information before it was publicly made available. And that alone, I think, amped up the surveillance. I mean, she was certainly under FBI surveillance, CIA surveillance. Her phones were tapped, even going back years prior. So I think that was certainly a turning point for her safety. She met with Mark Lane. She met with Jim Garrison. She knew them. And really, it was really almost a 2-year time period of just very critical, very questioning. Howard Brennan, who identified Oswald as the shooter, she recreated that scene of, could you see someone standing from where he was compared to where he claimed Oswald had been standing, the TSVD, to get those accurate description of a shooter, you know, height and weight and hair color and everything. So she was very critical of that. She thought that story fell apart because it just didn't make sense that he could have ID'd him from that position. Also, in the next month, in September of 64, she ran a blind item, which we today know was about Aquila Clemens, who was a witness to Officer Tippett's shooting. She published a short interview with her saying she saw not one but two men involved in the death, neither one fitting Oswald's description, and how she had been threatened by law enforcement to keep her mouth shut about that there was a concern about her life being in danger. And Aquila was never called to testify before the Warren Commission about what she had seen. I don't know if it was maybe some prejudice. She was African American. She was a little older. I think they said her diabetes was preclude her from testifying, or, you know, stuff like that, where I think Dorothy felt like the Warren Commission had an idea of what happened and then took kind of selective evidence to piece it together into what they wanted to present. So when the Warren Commission was officially released, Dorothy did not write a lot about it, which was kind of surprising to me going through her columns. But then it became obvious that we know she was writing a book about the assassination, and I think maybe was trying to save some things. She would go on radio. She did interviews about, you know, questioning these kind of missing witnesses, people changing their stories, the gun changing weapon, you know, just whoever would listen. I think she was very dogged in that. And I think that just came from decades as an investigative journalist, that this didn't make sense. This didn't add up. She did not think Oswald acted alone. She thought there was a definite conspiracy and cover up. And, you know, I can get into even more about this, where you talk about, hey, how was she killed? Why was she killed? Well, about 15 months before Dorothy's death, she was sent to Europe on a press junket for The Sound of Music, that film. And she met a reporter on that junket named Ron Pataki. And he's someone who's very person of interest in the Dorothy world. When Lee Israel wrote her book on Dorothy in the late 70s, she only referred to him as the out-of-towner. And my article was the first to name him. And so this was kind of a collaborative effort between me and my father, Larry Jordan, who is a longtime JFK researcher, journalist, very well established. And so a bit unconventional, but he actually handled the interviews with Ron Pataki, with me being a teenager at the time. And I can't think of any other author who had the same rapport developed with Ron Pataki that my father had. They would talk back and forth for about 10 years, first in preparation of the article, and then even years afterward, which we found a little odd because it certainly cast some shade on his intentions and his involvement and interest in Dorothy. They met on this press junket. He claimed it was a platonic relationship. People who knew Dorothy claimed it was more than that. She was in her early 50s. He was, I believe, 29 when they met. And I think that he was paid or hired, however you want to say it, to keep her under surveillance. And so that's really some information that I think is unique to my work is obviously when you call up someone and say, I think you killed her, I think you've kept her under surveillance, they're not that willing to open up to you. But the approach our publication took was maybe a little friendlier. Ron Pataki was an entertainment reporter in Ohio. And, just talking shop, kind of keeping him engaged from kind of a journalistic standpoint and keeping kind of a friendly rapport. And so I bring this up to say that as Pataki and my father, talked through the months, through the years, more information would come out. And Pataki pretty much confessed to having been involved in the Guatemalan coup of 1954. And so why is that interesting? So Pataki had been a student at Stanford University and got into a little trouble and ended up being expelled. And we kind of know today from declassified documents that the CIA was using Stanford in a bit of a covert sort of way. And I have Ron Pataki's school transcripts that show he was fluent in Spanish, had an interest in foreign service. And I think when he left schooling that summer of 54, he was recruited on campus by the CIA to be sent to Guatemala. He admitted to being there. He referred to it as a small military operation, but was kind of vague with the details. So, we kind of chewed on that for a while and figured, well, there wasn't a military operation. He was never officially in the military. This was a paramilitary operation. It was a CIA-backed coup to overthrow the democratically elected president. There's a lot you can go into that. It's very Machiavellian and a very dark history in American geopolitics. But he was there and he was involved in that service. And I think because he was involved in Guatemala through the CIA in the 50s, I think he remained, if you will, on the CIA payroll. And so after he got out of Guatemala, finished schooling, so on and so forth, became a newspaper reporter. And I think he was deemed probably the perfect person to befriend Dorothy. She liked younger men. At one time, she dated Johnny Ray, who was a singer much younger than her. And I think he kind of fit the profile, kind of young, ambitious, charismatic, a fellow writer. They could bounce ideas off each other. Pataki certainly said that she talked to him a lot about her investigation of the Kennedy assassination. So I think he was positioned. I don't think it was a coincidence he met her in Europe and then befriended her and engaged in this extramarital affair, because I think he was paid to keep her under surveillance. And again, based on his involvement in a known CIA operation, I think it's very possible he was part of Operation Mockingbird and, had that connection with working with the government. I just think the more I delved into his past, the more I think it seemed possible that he would be the type to befriend her. And I can certainly build into that a little bit more as we keep talking about kind of like the weeks, months leading up to Dorothy's death and how I feel like Pataki was likely involved in her death.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing here, but with Operation Mockingbird, if you read the official document, it says it ended after 4 months. I think there's documentation or even documents released later that show that even after it said it ended after 4 months, that it was still continuing. Gordon McClendon is a good example. He owned one of the radio stations that are highly involved with Jack Ruby. He's actually listed on close friend to Jack Ruby. But he worked with David Atlee Phillips in certain paramilitary operations over there. And then also Jay Schatz is a lesser known one, but he owned a couple other radio stations. But it seems like anyone that had like a war background eventually ended up owning a radio station or some type of newspaper magazine. And you have to start thinking, okay, could this be something like Operation Mockingbird, where, I mean, how many media articles were really going with the official narrative back then? I mean, we have documentation saying that Jim Garrison is making a whole piece or some type of special based on the critique of the Warren Commission. So you, AKA, have to shoot him down. That's quoted in a document. I mean, that's not your free press doing the proper reporting they're supposed to be doing.
Sure, absolutely. So, yeah, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, in the weeks leading up to Dorothy's death, why do you think this was some type of spying or operation keeping notes on him?
Sure. So let's fast forward. Would be October of 65. And couple things happened. One thing I think is important to note because fans have pointed this out that on October 24th of 65, just minutes before she was going to go live for What's My Line, there was an announcement over the intercom of the theater saying that the keys to Ron Pataki's hotel room are waiting at the front desk of the Regency Hotel. Obviously, a message meant for Dorothy. And I think this so rattled Dorothy because when the show started, typically as a panel was announced, they'd stand, give a little introduction to the next person. They'd all remain standing as Sean Daly came out and the show began. So Dorothy, when she came out on the panel, immediately sat down and then stood back up, kind of like, oh, that's not how we do it. So kind of linking that announcement to what we saw as being maybe a little more of a nervous Dorothy, which was a bit out of character. I mean, she was very competitive. She was very into winning and playing the game. So we have that anecdote. And then also we know that that final few weeks before her death, she spent some time in New Orleans for sure. I think also Miami, for research. And this is a story that had remained, I would say, a bit unknown. Some of the biggest sources of information through the years have come from taped video interviews on her two hairdressers, Charles Simpson and Mark Sinclair, and who are both deceased now. And so Pataki was not friends with them, did not like them, and clearly. But I think when you think about hairdressers, in a lot of ways, they're kind of like maybe a bartender, someone that you would
Yeah,
maybe really,
therapist.
yeah, right. And they were both, at least in my mind, gay, not interested in her in that kind of way, and, became confidants. And so that month leading up to Dorothy's death, she asked Mark Sinclair to accompany her to New Orleans. They were not to travel together, stay together. She'd actually been coming back from Las Vegas to see Johnny Ray perform. So they traveled differently, separately, and he did not know the full extent of the trip. But she said that she did not want anyone to know about it. And he felt like she was doing some research. Certainly we know New Orleans is the birthplace of Lee Harvey Oswald. Certainly Jim Garrison. This would be about a year before his official investigation. But as district attorney, would maybe be someone Dorothy would be interested in chatting with. Carlos Marcello, certainly the Mafia Don controlled that area. Hale Boggs represented that area as a congressman and who was on the Warren Commission. So those are kind of speculations on the nature of what she would have been probing into, or the types of people she'd be interested in meeting with. But in just about a day's time, she called him at his hotel and told him, "I have a plane ticket waiting for you at the airport. I'd like you to leave now and not tell anyone that you were with me." And she stayed behind. So this was a story that he told, many years after Dorothy's death, to honor, not revealing he'd accompanied her. But his impression was something was going on, something she had stumbled on that had maybe spooked her enough that she did not want Mark to get caught up in anything. Because I don't think Dorothy's scared easily, but I think she maybe was going to meet with a source or meet with someone that she was concerned, had some safety concerns with. Um, it's not totally known, and I think it's kind of a complicated story because she felt the need to bring someone with her. I don't know, it was just kind of backup. Certainly, he traveled with her at times just to do her hair. And so that may have been kind of a 2 for 1, do my hair and I'll check in with you so someone knows where I am, keep it kind of vague, and was enough that she sent him home. So she was telling her friends and the hairdressers that she felt like her life was being threatened. She was getting weird letters, weird phone calls. Even Pataki, she confided in about just this sense of not feeling totally safe. And so we fast forward to the night before she died. So she went on What's My Line Sunday night, November 7th, 1965. And Mark Sinclair did her hair. And he described that she seemed a bit down, not totally herself. And she said, well, I just feel like there are things that are different. Things about me there's leaks of information. And she did not really elaborate very much. And long story short, he turned to her and said, the only thing different or new in your life is this relationship with Ron Pataki. He is your mole. And, she sat there, thought about it, and said that she'd call him and, chat about this. And so Mark went home. And when he turned on What's My Line that evening, he was surprised to see that she had changed her dress because he tried to match the hairstyle to the dress. And he described it as more of a going out evening kind of gown that did not, frankly, match the tone he was going for with the hairstyle. And so he felt like she called Pataki after their talk. And the way it ended was, well, I'll come and see you. I'll get on a plane from Columbus, Ohio, and, we'll talk this evening. What's My Line would have gone out pretty late, about 10 o'clock Eastern time. So give a little time, right, to meet up. And there's evidence that supports this based on after the show got out, she and Bob Bach, who was a co-producer of the show, they went and had a drink at PJ Clark's, kind of killing a little time before she went over to the Regency. And people involved in the show, including Catherine Stone, who was one of the mystery guests, saw Dorothy with a man at the bar. And, it certainly is unfortunate that no one really followed up on who was this man? Was it Pataki? I'm sure this could have easily been ascertained if the police had done any questioning or circulated a photo. It didn't seem like a huge mystery. It just seemed like she was having kind of what was described as a very personal, kind of intense conversation, and people had decided not to approach her table to interrupt. And so I feel like that was a lead that was not really followed up on. And so in the wee hours of the next morning, she called Western Union, as she often did, to say that her column for the next day's paper was just kind of in between the door at her house. And that's how it was curried back and forth from the paper. She had a home office, so Western Union would take her column to the Journal American. So that was officially the last people to talk to her. And then it was kind of pandemonium the next day. So as Mark Sinclair described it, he went to her house the next morning around kind of the 8:30, 9 o'clock hour, had his own key, let himself in the back entrance. Now, Dorothy obviously had quite a lot of wealth at this time. She had, I believe it was an 8-story townhouse, 8 or 9 stories, multi-million dollar property today. And so you could really kind of come and go without other people in the house necessarily knowing about it. So he came up the back stairs, went to a room where he traditionally would do her hair, kind of off a dressing room. And that's when he found her in that bedroom. And so it was a bedroom that was not really used by Dorothy. It was kind of the place where you take guests visit and say, "This is my bedroom, put your coat on the bed." So she wasn't known to sleep there. And so he approached her and clearly saw she was deceased, sitting up in bed with a nightgown on over her dress, her hairpiece still in, which you would not want to sleep with, her false eyelashes still on, that book, she'd finished reading, what looked very staged, whether that was staged by her killer or staged by someone in the household. That's a bit up for debate. But someone put her in that bed. Someone had found her elsewhere, or she'd been elsewhere and was put in that bed after her death. Rigor mortis had set in, so some time had passed. And Mark called James Clement, who was the live-in butler, and he seemed to already be aware of Dorothy's death. So had he found her first? That's definitely been speculated that maybe she'd been found in the bathroom and they did not want to leave her that way for the police. But the air conditioning was turned on, so it was certainly a scene that defied just a natural causes kind of death. And in the day, really the day following her death, it was ruled kind of unofficially maybe a heart attack. And that's what the newspapers reported initially. And then after the autopsy, it was confirmed to have been a barbiturate and alcohol overdose. And the story kind of ended there, that it was deemed, actually surprisingly, was deemed circumstances undetermined, which is kind of an unusual way, I think, to have written a death certificate. It wasn't suicide, it wasn't floated, wasn't ruled an accident, and certainly not homicide, but undetermined. And so when you fast forward to the late 60s, there was more analysis done on those tissue samples that were saved for analysis. And so this was actually John Broich who talked with Midwest Today, with our publication, about what turned up in those results. Because at the time, you could not really differentiate among barbiturates. You could just say there were barbiturates. So when this analysis was done in the late 60s, it was determined that she had 3 barbiturates in her system. She had the cenocarbaitol, the amorbarbital, and the Nembutal. And she was not known to take all of those. So that kind of lended credence to, had her drink been spiked? Had someone that man, mystery man in the bar, had he put something in her drink and took her home and
Is it
held up the effects?
Sequel barbital?
Yeah, I can never pronounce those very well,
Well,
but all
that's
of those.
truth serum. They used that in interrogations. They gave that to Ruby, and they gave that to a few other people to try and some witnesses that said they saw something. But they used it for Sirhan's trial too with the hypnosis stuff.
So it makes you wonder, why would all that be in her system? And so she had only had the prescription for I guess it was the Seconal, but yeah, I mean, I think that's where we were kind of all in this research world saying, I think there's some potential concern there, that where did these other drugs come from, and how did they get into her system? And of course, the notes she had related to her book disappeared. A lot's been made of that. She had given some copies to a friend, Florence Pritchard Smith, who died the next day. A lot of people are interested in Florence's story. I don't know if there's enough evidence to support she met with foul play. She had been ill with leukemia at the time, but there was not much of a investigation. So she's often cited on kind of those inconvenient death websites, if you will. Florence was a reporter with the Journal American. She'd had an affair with JFK. And in the late 50s, her husband, Earl T. Smith, was ambassador to Cuba. And I think at the very least, the Smiths were maybe a source of information for Dorothy on her copious amounts of articles pertaining to Cuba. So that's an interesting connection there. Whether she had met with foul play or was the natural causes of her illness, That's not really known. But she allegedly had copies of some of Dorothy's notes. Another thing I investigated in my research was the summer before Dorothy's death, she spent some time in Switzerland. And I think it's very possible she maybe got a safety deposit box. Maybe we know she stored some jewelry, some valuables there. Um, kind of as a precaution against, legal action, lawsuits, just wanting to kind of safeguard some of her assets. And so I've always wondered if maybe some of the research material had found its way there. Um, and I think, too, her husband could have destroyed some things after her death. Richard certainly had made some cryptic comments about things he was not at liberty to talk about. And he, too, died a few years later of a drug overdose that was maybe likely a suicide, but any information he could have had, he took with him to the grave. So that's
Richard,
that information.
did Richard ever explain or have skepticism on the official, guess, death uh, of her, well, his wife?
Yeah. Not that he ever really talked about. He remarried not long after, and that youngest son went off to school, just kind of sent him away, which certainly was a bit mysterious since there was always kind of rumors about his paternity. But um, he definitely had a drinking problem, and it just seemed like Dorothy, not having with Dorothy gone, their life dramatically changed. She was very much the primary breadwinner. So it seemed like he kind of slipped further into kind of a sad situation with the drinking. But he really had just said there were things about the case and her work that he was not at liberty to say. But I hadn't really come across a lot of thoughts specifically on her death.
Well, what about the communication with Mark Lane? Did she, I can't remember if it's Mark Lane or not, but she talked about planning a trip to go to New Orleans, if I'm not mistaken. That again, that's coming from what I've read when it came to finding her in her bed with her reading glasses on and stuff like that. But I was curious if she made plans for a week later or 2 weeks later, a trip that she was going to take. Because I know a lot of people, like I said, in the mysterious death camp. I'm very trying to find evidence of like how we can support this, and it's very difficult because things weren't followed up on, which makes it almost impossible in the JFK case to really draw the. I mean, you could draw your own conclusions, but to say this is 100% this.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to probe. As far as I know about public comments she had made um, about Lane, just found him to be a very good researcher. Said he seemed very genuine, but did not really go into a lot of detail on any more thoughts about him. But had met him on a few occasions when he was in New York. Was invited over to her house, and I thought very strangely that Pataki sat in on those meetings, as well as the few times she met with Jim Garrison, because it just, I think it points to Pataki kind of ingratiating himself into the circle. Remember, he was an entertainment reporter for the Columbus Citizen Journal, and he covered plays. He was like a play and movie reviewer. So why the interest in the Kennedy assassination? Why was he trying to kind of follow Dorothy along on these interviews and these trips? Um, that to me lended credence to him being kind of a plant, if you will. Because Ron Pataki bragged about that, to my father, that, I knew everyone. I knew all these people. I knew, I was there for so many of these big meetings. And I mean, I don't see why he would have been so interested. Um,
Did he ever explain knowing
no.
Angleton?
I don't think, at least to me, there was not talk of Angleton. I mean, I think he's a very important figure in all of this, but no, that wasn't someone he had bragged about knowing, because he was very, I know mobsters, I know the Kennedys, I know everyone. And again, I bring this up. I think it kind of begs the question of why. He dated Mia Farrow at a time. He was really good friends with Robert Redford and Betty White. How was he so well connected? And so that's why I felt like he was perhaps on the CIA payroll because of this budget he had to travel and go all these places and meet all these people. It's not typical of a newspaper in that size of a city. Just how well connected he was. Just always surprised me that I think he was sent on these assignments, and the cover story would be reviewing a movie or a play wherever he was sent by the CIA.
Did you ever try and track down where her notes or any possible maybe thoughts on where her notes could have gone to?
Well, and that's why I thought it was a possibility that when she had spent that summer in Switzerland, something could have been stored there. I don't know that for a fact, but I think it's an interesting theory because we know that the Swiss banking laws are a little different from, a little more private, a little more security. I think that's potential. Obviously, the thoughts on Florence Pritchard Smith having had copies and then herself dying is a heck of a coincidence, at least. And again, I think anything that remained, it sounded like her husband could have taken and destroyed. I know the butler, like I said, had been a little nervous to talk to reporters. His wife also lived in the house. She was a maid. Their daughter Brenda has talked to some writers in recent years. Unfortunately, she did not get back to my inquiries, but Brenda felt like, in talking to her father, people had come into the house after Dorothy's death and started taking boxes from her in-home office. Now, if that's true, I think that's certainly suspicious of who were they. I mean, I think the impression was maybe FBI or law enforcement. I doubt they had a warrant. So that was her story. And again, I don't know. That was kind of a second-hand story she was telling. She was not there at the time. So what do you make of that today? But they were an African American family, and I think that they did not necessarily feel safe talking about their employer, or just feeling like maybe they had to stay in their place, or like who were they going to call, to report people coming into the house or things being missing or stuff like that. So unfortunately, so much time has passed to really know what to follow up with on that lead. That's just what she had said her parents had witnessed of things being removed. And certainly if that's true, I think that's a very big possibility that things were destroyed.
Yeah. Do you know how she got access to interview Jack Ruby? A lot of press reporters were trying to interview Ruby, but none of them could get access.
Absolutely. And this is an example of how Dorothy's celebrity, if you will, opened doors for her. So Jack Ruby's defense team largely consisted of Melvin Belli, who was really at that time a lawyer to mobsters and movie stars. He was not a criminal defense attorney. And Joe Tonnahill was co-counsel. He was more of a local, at least a Texan. And they were the two main lawyers on the case at the time. And Melvin Belli had kind of this aspiration to be in pictures and television. He later did do some television work. And I think it was not unreasonable of Dorothy to say, I could probably help you with that, or make some connections or some phone calls, and maybe promised him some opportunities in that department. To say, I'd like to talk to Ruby one-on-one. I think he was very starstruck by Dorothy, and I think there were maybe some promises made of introducing him to certain people. But that is who she targeted as the way to get to Ruby, was through his defense attorneys. And then, of course, the judge had to sign off on it. So as far as I can determine, Dorothy met with Ruby on 2 occasions. First one being a very brief discussion. The second one having been witnessed by Joe Tonnahill from a distance, enough that they were in eyesight of him, but he was not able to hear the whole conversation. And it was not a long conversation, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. But again, as a journalist myself, I'm a newspaper magazine reporter. You don't necessarily need a lot of time to get information out of someone. You could ask just a handful of questions and get some good information. It wouldn't have to be a really extensive sit down kind of interview. And Unfortunately, it's not totally known what they discussed. I mean, I think that there's certainly, as her columns progressed, maybe you could see kind of things she was grappling with or looking for answers to, but the exact nature of their conversation is not known. But I think she felt like, really, as she wrote in her column, that the more you got to the heart of Oswald, the more you'd understand the motive for Ruby's involvement. She did not seem to believe that this was just kind of a random act of a crime of passion, kind of thing, that this was,
A spur of
Ruby
insanity.
was, yeah, because that's what his defense attorneys tried to claim. And of course, he got the death penalty. I mean, he was convicted.
Yeah,
And
there's an oral history interview with Robert Dennison, who's the family lawyer for Jack Ruby, and their whole Rubenstein family, and he talked about speaking with Melvin Belli and Melvin Belli pitching that to him, and he was like, "Man, you're really trying to sell the son, aren't you?" And apparently, Melvin Belli didn't really believe it either. They were just trying to save Ruby the death penalty, but clearly, Ruby gave some important information to Dorothy Kilgallen. I'm curious if you were able to uncover maybe hints of anything that they could have talked about, or do you believe in your mind that he named any specific individuals? Because clearly Ruby's talking about going to Washington. He knew something was going on. Um, and for everybody, I think that's the giant what if. Like, what could he possibly have discussed?
because certainly his testimony before the Warren Commission, although had some cryptic statements, a bit rambling, he always wanted to emphasize, I am working alone. Like, it seemed very important to keep saying, at least publicly, no one made me do this. I'm just my own free agent here. And so I would think Ruby was maybe, I don't know if he would just outright say something to Dorothy, but maybe kind of hinting at different aspects to probe or different people to pursue. I mean, certainly wanting to do some investigating in New Orleans. I think that could certainly have been something Ruby may have contributed to that thought process. Um, but like I said, it's hard to know. I mean, some of this was what was intended for this book project that never saw the light of day. So, it's kind of conjecture in terms of just kind of what she did publish and what she continued to write about after Ruby's conviction that gives you some ideas. I mean, certainly, um, my book, kind of how I've tried to structure things was, what did Dorothy write about? What do we kind of know about this today? Kind of juxtapose that. But I also try to probe other aspects of the case too that she would not have necessarily even known about. So there's a little bit of that too, of other things that have been explored. I mean, I certainly think, I don't know if people are familiar with what the doctor saw, but I thought that documentary was very interesting on the wounds, so I talk about that a little bit too. So, definitely supplementing Dorothy's reporting, is a mission of the book too, to kind of bring in, maybe she was hinting at this or wondering about this. Well, what's out there today?
I believe in your
So
book
I,
you
I certainly
mentioned
do that.
in your book you mentioned the Malcolm Kilduff speech at Parkland Hospital, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. And, it's such a story that I think is a little wild. I mean, certainly we talk about, there are doctors who felt like these, at least some of the wounds came from the front. They were kind of coerced into changing that story. They were threatened by FBI agents at a press conference not to talk about that. Um, kind of were taking the body. There was a lot of that going on. The Secret Service removing Kennedy's body from Parkland Hospital, even though they had wanted it to stay for a local autopsy to be done. Um, so I think if Dorothy had known some of that, I don't know if that would have also contributed to some of her thought processing. But I think that's certainly concerning that the body was removed, and I think, as well as some of the other researchers, that the wounds were altered. between Parkland and arriving at Bethesda. One thing I wanted to bring up, because I think I haven't seen that in a lot of other books, is this idea of the two caskets, right? That one actually had Kennedy's body, and then the other was kind of more for show.
It was 3 caskets.
So,
At least from what I've heard from William Law, Cybert O'Neill, and whoever that they've interviewed and stuff like that. That has always been a crazy one for me. There's like an ambulance that went
it's a
missing for
crazy
45
story.
minutes.
It's a crazy story, but um, the thing I brought up here that I think at least gives some pause is how would you orchestrate more than one casket? How would you get it in and out of the hospital? And how would, what would people think when they saw it at the airport or whatever? So one thing that I discovered in just reading, newspaper archives of that time period is there was a news release in the papers, anyone Walter Cronkite reporting that a Secret Service agent had been killed in the line of duty. And so I think that had been a cover story in case more than one casket was detected. Because it was a flash in the pan story, it was never followed up on. It just went away. That in the Malay, someone else was shot, there was another casualty. And I think that was planted in the press in case people saw more than one casket coming in and out, that's a Secret Service agent we're meeting. And then that story, like I said, just vanished. So I thought that was an interesting example of how you can find news releases, reports today that talk about another fatality to perhaps lend credence to there being more than one casket. Like I said, it was really
It
never
would
followed up on.
it would
You
explain
know,
the pool of blood in Dealey Plaza that's sitting there close by the knoll.
I mean, yeah. I mean, there's a lot to digest. I mean, there's a lot to go into. I mean, I certainly try to unravel it a little bit, but I thought that that was at least an interesting anecdote of how you would think they'd have to be pretty certain there had been a fatality. And then there was never any corrections of no, never mind. It was only Kennedy and, of course, Connolly wounded. And then, it wasn't Tippit. This wasn't referring to Tippit. So, yeah, it just seemed like a cover story, and even in my book, I talk about a couple of journalists, both women who were with kind of rival papers in Dallas. They were there, they covered it, and their copy was changed. There were things they weren't allowed to write about, talking to the doctors, talking about the wounds. And I think to me that this speaks of a cover up that was in progress before the assassination even happened. Um, why suppress this information? Why tell the doctors they can't talk about the wounds? Parkland Hospital was at that time, I'm sure today, trauma informed. They were one of the best trauma hospitals in the country. Accident, gunshot wound victims. They saw a lot of gruesome things. And I think if their opinion was some wounds came from the front, I think they know more than politicians, on the Warren Commission. I think that they're a better source of information. I think not everyone thought there was a conspiracy, but a lot of those doctors who spoke felt like Oswald did not act alone or wasn't even completely involved. So that's very interesting
Were you
to go in.
surprised at did you come across the anomalies, I would call them, just the weird stuff in Dealey Plaza? I'd mentioned one already. There was a pool of blood by the knoll in Dealey Plaza. There's pictures of it. Jerry Coley took photos of it. I think I have it clipped up on my channel, but he, in an interview later, talked about his photos being taken by the FBI. Then there's the Mr. X that arrived at Parkland Hospital in Bertha Lozano's testimony. She talked about a man bleeding in a suit carried by Secret Service agents called a Mr. X. That arrived at Parkland Hospital around the same time JFK did. And then there's also the seizure victim, Jerry Belknap. The reason that's suspicious is if you look through a lot of Dallas police officers' testimonies and statements from what they were doing when they were supposed to be protecting the motorcade or watching the motorcade, they all talk about, we were focused on this guy who had a seizure. And I'm like, I have 8 different officers clipped up and put on YouTube where their only testimony of being a witness that day was that they were helping a seizure victim out. The suspicious thing is, which a lot of people point out, is he never signed in and he never signed out. He just walked away, which busy hospital. You got the president there. I don't think that's as much suspicious. The interesting part is that that whole week lining up before the arrival in the motorcade in Dallas is that they were getting false ambulance calls to Dealey Plaza. So people suspect that was a timing thing to time how fast the ambulance could arrive and get there and do that, whether it was a distraction or not. I mean, there's these anomalies that pop up in the assassination, and I call them that because we don't have any endpoints to them because they were never investigated, like the man on the grassy knoll or the fake Secret Service agent. I'm curious what you found the most interesting if you came across one of these anomalies, if you came across anything that just was never followed up, like you've mentioned already, but something that to you was just really, really suspicious or strange that just gave you a red flag.
Yeah. I mean, I think one person that I've researched, I don't know if you know Roger Craig, but I thought he was very interesting. One of many, right? Sheriff's deputy. And, he was interviewed a little later in his life about that day. And, some of the things I thought were odd were being told, you're just a spectator. You're not here to provide any security or crowd control, very hands off, and just found that being odd to not really be asked to do your job. He was also there during some of Oswald's interrogation, and at least in Roger Craig's terms, had said that he felt like Oswald felt his cover had been blown. Just in the statements he made about now people will know who I am, um, kind of witnessing what is this guy talking about? This is, getting an impression of Oswald that was not going to be the official story. And really, there were other things he talked about, but also, his own life being threatened. I mean, literally being shot at on the street one time. And of course he died under mysterious circumstances as well. A suicide allegedly.
With a
And
rifle. That's
with a
what's
rifle. Yeah.
crazy.
You remember that? Yeah. Yeah. So I find him credible because I feel like he had received threats for talking about what he saw that day and still was willing, to put himself out there. I think he was also involved in that initial identification of the weapon found at the TSBD, identifying it as a Mauser. And I know there's stories about how that changed. Dorothy questioned how that weapon could change so dramatically. What were there two weapons? Were they switched? Was there never a Mauser? Was it always? I think he was at least one of those first people to come upon that weapon and said that some of his colleagues in the police or the sheriff's department identified it as a German Mauser. It was marked like it said Mauser, and were skilled, I guess, gunmen or marksmen, if you will, familiar with weapons, and was uncomfortable with how that story had changed. Just as a for instance, I mean, it seems like there's a lot of this out there.
I'm going to ask what your opinion is on Oswald, if you believe he fired a shot or if you believe he's just completely innocent. Because there's a lot of things. I mean, if you just read through the number of witnesses at the TSBD, the people that work there, I couldn't even tell Oswald even showed up that day. That's how bad it was based on everybody's testimony. They're like, I've never seen Lee Harvey Oswald, or I don't recall seeing him on this day. And I'm like, you guys work there. You didn't come across the dude at all? I mean, I know he's a loner and he kept to himself, and then you only have a couple statements from maybe two or three individuals that two of those individuals saw him on the first floor. So it goes with Bart Camp's work about Prayer Man, which I don't necessarily believe. But then you have another person that on the fifth floor that talked about this guy came up to us and asked what we were all looking at, and we said the president was about to ride through, and then he walked away. I'm like, yeah, as an assassin, that's what you want to do. Just ask people, hey guys, the president's coming to town. We don't have anything else going on today, besides work. It's kind of a special event.
Yeah, it certainly seemed like people I had come across who interacted with Oswald saw him at various points of the day that would made it very hard to have performed that, gotten that shot off, I guess you could say. Um, yeah, I mean, I think just from what I've delved into that I think he was aware of. I mean, this wasn't the only assassination attempt. There had been an attempt in Chicago. There had been other concerns, the FBI was following up with. So I think he knew about these threats, if you will. And I think he was being used by the CIA. I think he was known to them. I think he was, he was very intelligent. He was very well educated. And I think he was playing kind of both sides of the pro Castro, anti Castro. I think he was, I guess what you'd call like sheep dipping that term. I think that that's very possible. And I think he was probably surprised that he was then implicated in the assassination. I think he felt like he was not going to be, that he maybe knew of what was happening and was probably shocked, saying that he's a patsy and his cover's been blown. I think those are some odd comments to make. And I think it would have been interesting if this had gone to trial, really, of what would have come out. And I think the fact that it didn't, that he was pretty much silenced, I think that began these people like Dorothy and others who began wanting some serious questions answered.
Do you believe Ruby was paid to silence Oswald? And if you do, who do you think would have paid? I think it's Dallas police. I know I believe CIA plot overall to get Kennedy or some type of military industrial complex thing. But I believe with the Ruby stuff, there's a lot of evidence to support that. I mean, there's stuff I'm learning about the basement shooting that I've never heard before. Tom Howard being in the basement, from two other reserve officers in the basement talked about seeing Tom Howard, a friend of Ruby's, I think an attorney at a point, that talked about seeing Tom Howard walk up, ask when Oswald was being transferred, look and see Oswald through one of the windows as he was coming down, and then say, "That's all I needed to see," and then walk out. And could that have been an alert to Ruby? I have no clue. Ruby was easily accessible to that basement. He could have got in through, and many of his connections with the Dallas police. But I do think it's suspicious that if Dorothy Kilgallen interviewed Ruby, I just think at one point he might have slipped and said something about maybe his role in it. And I think it might have been something about being hired by Dallas police or someone to do the shooting of Oswald, because Dallas police manipulated a lot of evidence that came out after the fact on Oswald, because they were only getting him for killing a cop. They never truly charged him with the president's assassination, but the paper bag that was found later was manufactured. There's a lot of evidence to support that. That was supposed to cover that rifle. And there's a lot of things that just did not make sense when it came to just the active activities of the Dallas Police Department. And they have been known to have a track record. I think, who was it, Henry Wade, that had a conviction rate of something that would be phenomenal. Like, you could be an expert in your field and still not get that number or percentage of a conviction rate. He sent many people to the electric chair that were innocent. So I just think there's a lot of evidence to support that they had to wrap up Oswald, and the best way to do that was to get someone they had a connection with, like Jack Ruby, a low-level crime figure, and get him to do the deed.
Well, and just in what I was able to research, it sounded like Texas laws at the time did have some leniency for crimes of passion. And I think I would assume if you're recruited to kill someone and it was going to be a very obvious crime that you were the perpetrator, he had to have been given some kind of assurance that it would maybe be a small amount of time in prison. We'll get you out in a few years. You'll be a hero. I think it would have to be presented in such a way where your suffering would be pretty minor to agree to go along with this. So I think him getting, this murder one conviction probably was a shock to Ruby. And even just in like I said, some of my other research, I had heard that, Richard Nixon had, when he saw Oswald, and shot by Ruby, that he felt like he had seen Ruby before, that he had been hired by Lyndon Johnson at a time to be a witness on, during some of the House Un-American Activities hearings, that he, Nixon had kind of a photographic memory and felt like he had seen Ruby before. I think that's a possibility. I mean, I certainly feel like I'm kind of the LBJ involvement, CIA kind of camp. I mean, when you think of who would benefit directly from JFK's death. And obviously, it would be Lyndon Johnson. And of course, I delve a little bit into, his scandals and, the hearings on that and, kind of people disappearing. And I think, perhaps, Johnson having, people killed. I mean, there's all sorts of those stories out there. And I think he may have seen Kennedy as just kind of another one of those people to get rid of, for his own personal gain. And certainly he had the CIA to work with. When Kennedy's body was taken to Bethesda, that was a naval hospital. So you'd be under kind of a court martial situation to follow certain orders. He just seemed very involved every step of the way.
Well, I was pretty happy when I came across your work, and also it was recommended by a friend of mine. It might be a mutual friend of ours, but Gary Hill. He wrote the other Oswald, and I have to ask you this, but were you shocked and this changed the way you think about history or politics or anything like that? Because I knew what I would call like modern day. I know the deep kind of corrupted politics, but when we talk about examining and when I first dived into the JFK assassination, I was blown away learning about LBJ and the whole Box 13 scandal, the Mac Wallace stuff, and so much stuff where, I mean, just horrible stories of presidents pissing on Secret Service agents' legs, which is LBJ apparently did that based on one of the Secret Service agents' testimonies. And then corruption with Nixon, I think, is a little bit more well known. But you just start wondering, like, what's going on in our political establishments, at least? And it makes the JFK conspiracy. It makes it more understandable why a lot of people believe that there was some type of military involvement or some type of coup that happened because yeah, it's not the, I guess, the glamour picture we always get.
Sure, and I think it's so important. I think to see this sort of in the context of the Cold War era too. The unbridled power the CIA had, and people being under surveillance, and the FBI, and I don't think it's a fantastical kind of story. I mean, I think these things were happening: information suppression, things being manipulated. The military industrial complex angle. I mean, I think it's just a real possibility that this was orchestrated. That Kennedy. There's so much more to this. It was a very surfacey presentation of a lone assassin, one man alone. This wasn't going to go anywhere. We are going to kind of silence the story. Um, I think people like Dorothy weren't comfortable with that. And I know a lot of us today kind of get in that we're conspiracy, this conspiracy camp. But to me, that just means that I think more than two people were involved. We think there's more to the official story. And I think Dorothy just followed the trail. I mean, I think she had a great nose for news and just wasn't going to let this go. That the more she probed, the more she wanted to know, the more questions she had. Um, Another thing that came across my research, maybe your listeners are familiar with it, but I thought it was very compelling that a month after Kennedy's assassination, so in December of 1963, former President Harry Truman wrote a very lengthy opinion piece that ran in newspapers all across, the country, pretty much saying that the CIA has gotten too big, it's abusing power. I helped it start. I was there at its infancy, and it's a bit unhinged. And I just, it's fairly tame. I mean, I probably would have been a little more aggressive if I'd written it, but I think still explosive in terms of why write that column then? What was the point of kind of sounding the alarm bells, at that time? What was going on? It just seemed like the timing to me was not a coincidence.
Alan Dulles
Um,
made him
right.
recant that statement too. Told him to retract it and apologize to it. Truman wouldn't do it, but then Alan Dulles spoke for him.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. We certainly know the Dulles brothers have their fingers in a lot of um, very corrupt things through the years. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that is a very interesting thing to remind people about. We had a former president that was saying, "Wow, the CIA is abusing powers." Um, and another thing too, I've made a note of is the next day after Harry Truman wrote this article, Dorothy wrote her column about likening the assassination to that film 7 Days in May. that is the time frame that she wrote the column, just that day after Truman's remarks. So I don't know. I thought that seemed also to be connected, deliberate, of what she was implying from some of this information.
I began to like Truman a lot more because if you look into the death of Dag Hammarskjöld, his plane crash that happened, Truman made the weirdest thing, and I think you can look it up on C-SPAN or something. But he said to the press, he goes, he was on the verge of getting something done when they killed him, and then he stops and goes, "Notice how I said they killed him." And no press bothered to follow up on that. And I was like, wow, so it's getting caused an accidental plane crash. And then next thing Truman's making a statement like that. It makes it more interesting. I mean, even if you look at the number of people that made claims, or not claims, but came out when JFK died, Eisenhower was the weirdest for me because he never once mentioned Kennedy. He mentioned the president, he mentioned Jackie Kennedy, and then he went into other political assassinations and he talked about Abraham Lincoln. He named them all. Like he named Abraham Lincoln attempts on Truman's life, Teddy Roosevelt. He named those, but never mentioned JFK's name. He just said the president. And I was like, that's so weird. They're asking you about JFK and you spend all of your time talking about other political assassinations and how the people need to have faith in their government. I'm like, that just, to me, that was always suspicious or just cold hearted.
Yeah, I could see that.
But Sarah, you've given me enough of your time. I do appreciate you giving me the time today to talk about your book and also the JFK assassination.
Yes, I so appreciate it.
Is there a place where people can find any of your links if you have social medias, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and then also Amazon links as well too?
Sure. My book is available as a paperback. It's available as an ebook and also an audiobook. It's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, those major platforms. If you go to dorothykilgallen.net, that's my official website, you can order signed copies there and learn a little bit more about Dorothy. I have to give a brief shout out. I'm going to be speaking virtually at the 28th annual JFK Lancer convention. Like I said, I'll be virtual. You can attend in person or virtual. If you go to assassinationconference.com, you can get tickets there. So I'm excited to connect with other researchers at that, and we'll be preparing remarks for that pretty soon.
And I'll make sure I link all those links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.